Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bernie Chats. We're going to be starting a new series today that I'm excited to be calling Not So Typical Tourist. Our guest for this episode is Brent Antonson. It was a little bit hard to figure out where to start with Brent. He's an ESL teacher, an adventure traveler, an author, but he likes to be referred to himself as a literary travel master, which I suppose sums it all up nicely. I first met Brent on an airplane, of course. Of the dozens of people that I've chatted with and exchanged business cards with on airplanes, I think Brent is the only one that I've remained in contact with, and certainly the only one who has become a good friend. Brent has leveraged teaching English as a second language as a method for seeing the world and living in and amongst some of the world's most newsworthy and hard to access regions and cultures. He's visited or lived in places like North Korea, Iraq, Xinjiang, China, Voronezh, Russia, Belarus, Estonia, and more. In our first attempts to record this, the conversation moved rapidly from country to country. Ultimately, we decided to focus this recording on Russia and the 2008 book he wrote called Of Russia, A Year Inside. We also discussed his upcoming book with the working title, The Ties That Bind, which is about his travels around the world by train. The audio podcast version is a bit longer because it contains some of our pre- and post-recording chatter. It's also on the same topics. I hope you enjoy it. I always appreciate your feedback, and I'd especially love to receive your comments about this theme of not so typical tourist, or if you have any suggestions for guests, please enter them in the comments, or go to my website, berniechats.com, and contact me directly through there. Now, please like, share, and most importantly, please subscribe. It's a very important part of being able to build this channel. Enjoy the journey, my friends. So welcome, everybody. We're here with Brent Antonson, and we're going to talk today about his book Of Russia, which he wrote some time ago, but it's still relevant if you want to get a good snapshot of what Russia was like and what some of the foundational parts of Russia are. I read it in its entirety some time ago, and I just skimmed it a little bit. And at the time, I was quite impressed with your writing, Brent. And when I reread it today, reread parts of it, I thought to myself, wow, this is still really good writing. It's very engaging.
Oh, thank
So
you.
let's talk a little bit about the book and what drove you to write it, what drove you to go to Russia. Before that, do you want to maybe just give us a high level introduction to yourself and some of those motivations?
I was raised with traveling, and it was sort of in me. I was in the Soviet Union in 1974 when I was 5 years old and barely a recollection of it, and ended up traveling a lot as a kid. And then I traveled all of America, all of the states when I was 21, driving them, and then did Europe in a rush, and went into Croatia during the war by train, trying to get to Sarajevo just for the possibility of it happening, and ended up in Zagreb and being kicked out. Then I ended up in Estonia in a really weird sort of way. I went from thinking that I was going to be living in a small town in Wyoming, illegally working with my girlfriend, to abruptly ending up in 1994 in Estonia, which was the first Soviet republic to declare its independence. And so I was there 2.5 years after independence, and I did not like it at all. It was in a very bad state at the time. And then I ended up in 1997 taking the Trans-Siberian Railway with my dad and brother from Moscow to China through Mongolia, and then developed an entirely different appreciation than I had from the experience in Estonia. So that forced me to try and find a way that I could sort of extend the travel, the whole experience. And the best way to do that is, and was, to teach. And so I got a teaching certificate that was recognized overseas. I leapt at it. I took as many classes and courses as I could to sort of prep myself for the unpreparable, and ended up teaching at an Institute of Law and Economics in Voronezh, Russia, and then later at the State University in the same city. So that was my motivation to get there. And there was no attempt at trying to write a book. I had done that for traveling all of the American states, and writing a book is a brutal beast to try and tame. Coming from a family of writers, you just got hawks on your shoulder. and every word is weighed, and you don't want to offer up anything less than something that's palatable to them, and so you try and make it your best. There was no attempt to try and write a book, but the consequences of ending up there and how it abruptly ended in a very horrible way. My dad just said, you've got to write this because it's almost unbelievable. And so then the entire experience and rebuilt from just all my emails home and stuff, and the art that I'd done, the pictures I took, and the consequences of the times of Russia being in 2001, having been shortly independent itself, and lost and losing and finding its way, and all of these students trying to sort of master their own way and navigate this unnavigatable flood of new information, of the internet, of foreigners coming in to their cities. It was an incredible time, and so to be able to capture that in a book, in Word, is now a very important thing to look back on in every aspect, because Russia is now front and center in American politics, and has been that beast for the 2016 election. And at the time, 2001, the internet was almost non-existent, unrecognizable in its current form.
Yeah, it certainly is a good snapshot. And I mean, in the book, you cover a lot of topics like corruption, the education system, the way people do business, or the way that business is looked upon, which is quite interesting. And I guess those cultural aspects like drinking vodka and all these stereotypes that come to life for you in the book and in your travels. Are there any stories that stand out from the book that you'd like to go into? You can give us a little inkling about?
Russia at the time, it's almost incomparable to the lifestyle that was led then. And it's not led now, because I've been back numerous times. I went back and taught again in 2013, 2014, when the Sochi Olympics were on. To have students, I mean, everybody was vying for my time. I was this new, unique light in sort of a dark world. Now, I had a laptop, but nobody had a laptop in the city. A personal computer was almost non-existent. And they were only usually at the schools.
And this is 1997 you're talking, right?
2001.
Even at that time? Okay.
Even at that time.
Yeah.
There were two public places that you could go for the internet. There was a private enterprise in Voronezh, which had 10 computers, and most of those were always occupied by Black students that had come from Africa to get an education and then take it home.
Right.
And in horrible, horrible conditions. The other 10 computers were at the public library. The scanner that I was able to access to send my pictures home was at this public place in Voronezh. And so when I would take a class of students, these were all university, 5th and 6th years English students, and bring them to my place, my flat, which was in a Stalinist built period. It was a 1950s building, and just an incredible setup. And as I watch a movie right now for like the 60th time in the background, Brat, B-R-A-T, it means brother in Russian. It was done in, I believe, 1997. And the inside of every building in Russia that you see looks like a fire escape here. It looks like a parkade. Mm-hmm. It looks like a stairwell in a parkade without the handrails. It's a phenomenal way to live and to adapt to. And I had gotten that in Estonia. But when you purposely immerse yourself in culture and then find out that this is the way that people are living and you're living, and you sign a contract for 6 months and then you extend it for another year, and you become a part of this cog in the machine. And so things that we don't really do here, or that would seem to be things like the opera, the theater, the Philharmonic, these are things that people actually go to. And as I write, even hardened criminals go to the opera because it's just something you do. These students, their national poet is Pushkin. They know poems by heart. It's like Leonard Cohen songs. What would you recite here that would be comparable to knowing that much about any one Canadian's poetic endeavors, let alone a poet or a poet laureate, or to quote, Walt Whitman off the top of your head. But these are things that are ingrained in Russian people. And so it's a brilliant, you get into their minds and you learn, teaching was not what I wanted to do. It's not my forte. It was not completely educated in teaching and education. But to have pulled that through all of these countries many times, it's the most viable way to actually get to the grassroots of what a country looks like, because the students open their
Hmm.
ears are open to everything. They want to know everything about you and everything about your country. And at the same time, they'll give you access to their lives, to their families. They want all of your time. They want to expressly take you around and show you everything that they know. I had students who, some of them were married. They had, husbands who were in aviation, and I get parts of airplanes. I mean, I love, that. And they bring pictures that you could not possibly have gotten a hold of if you were a spy, and they're just dumping these on me. And so to have this as something that students would be, or that people would be willing to open their lives, and I call them students because that's what they were in effect. But you're just entering into people's lives, and and it unravels in a way that it's in an educated manner.
So I've got a couple of questions about that. You said you were perceived as being very special at the time because you were an English teacher in Russia. Were there other teachers in the country that were teaching English from English-speaking countries?
Were quite a few in Moscow. Having already been to Moscow quite a few times, almost as a luxury, and it's a luxury almost to hate Moscow because it's quite an ugly city. But to know that you want to be out and beyond that, and that the people in Moscow are generally regarded as, well, if you were from somewhere within BC and looking at Vancouver as sort of this opiate of the masses, this wonder to behold, and yet you don't want to go there. It's like coming to Vancouver and wanting to go to Prince George, as a Russian teacher. You just want to be immersed somewhere outside where people aren't fake. And the new Russian
Yeah.
syndrome was taking off then.
Yeah, it depends. I think what we're getting at here is the desire to see the country in its purest form without the international trappings.
I
And
owned realrussia.com in 2001
oh yeah, nice.
because we were expecting to build upon that, because outside of Moscow is a completely different country
Yeah,
than you would experience in Moscow. So
yeah.
these teachers that would be, even now, that the jobs online, a lot of them are for British and American schools that are teaching in Moscow. And I met lots of people who've been to Moscow, and it scares them. I mean, it's instant homesickness. You
Right.
go there, I want to go home. I don't want to be here.
Don't tell me that Red Square is not beautiful. It's got to be beautiful.
It's stunningly beautiful, and it's
Yeah.
made so. Goom is the department store that is on the eastern side, that flanks the eastern side of Red Square, opposite of the Kremlin. But I mean, it's Benetton, it's Gap, and everything's like
Oh,
three times
okay.
the price. Simply, it looks like, the part of West Edmonton Mall is replicated after it, where
Yeah.
you've got these dome ceilings and stuff. It's a phenomenal place, but you don't even want to be there. You just feel
Yeah.
out of your element, and it's for new Russians. It's for people who are making 10 times what I made a month. There's an old joke where a new Russian goes back to the Mercedes dealership and says, I need a new one. And the guy says, well, I just sold you that a couple of days ago. What's the matter with it? He goes, the ashtray's full.
The ashtray's full.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that kind of encapsulates the thinking of new Russians. It was
The new rich,
phenomenal amount of wealth.
the nouveau riche.
Nouveau riche in
Yeah.
Russia. So it's like you have the oligarchs who when they dismantled the Soviet system, were selling off state-run government things like
Yeah.
petroleum, or
Publicly held companies that went private, and there was no real government bank account to put the money in. It went into people's pockets.
well, the oligarchs bought these things at cut rate prices because the Russia had no
Right.
income. When the Soviet Union fell, I mean, everybody's looking for where the money's coming from, let alone all of the republics that were fledgling at the time, trying to
Yeah.
find their own way.
And American companies, probably one of the lead companies would have been McDonald's, going in and setting up shop in the country, and all the former Soviet Union countries. They were all claiming their territory, right? Saying, okay, they're open for business now. Let's go in and solidify our brand while the getting's good.
But even now, going to McDonald's there, it's not the experience here. It's like going to
Fine dining restaurant.
a fine dining restaurant. And people, you set up dates, you go there, and people they're dressed in suits, and they're going to McDonald's. You're waiting in line. Sometimes it's a block long.
Yeah, I remember in the early 90s going to the McDonald's in Hungary, in Budapest, and I'd never been in a McDonald's with chandeliers.
There
If
you
I remember,
go.
that's the way I remember it anyway. I think it was a converted train station, if I remember right.
The burgers, hamburger in Voronezh, it was an atrocity. It was two halves of. It was just it didn't even resemble a hamburger, and yet a McDonald's is sitting there ordering and holding to their policy of the lettuce has to be this many days old, it has to be this color green, the pickles have to be this X, Y, and Z. These have to all meet standards that in Russia don't exist. If
Mhm.
you get lettuce, you're like,
Yeah, they do.
wow,
They do customize their restaurants to the different countries for sure.
yeah,
Their menu rather, and the restaurants I gather. So Voronezh, it
Voronezh.
Voronezh. Sorry, thank you for the pronunciation. Voronezh. Where is it in proximity to Moscow?
It's an overnight train. I think it's 13 hours southeast.
Great.
It's toward the Urals. It's about another 24-hour train ride to the edge of Siberia.
So, especially at the time, it would have been off the beaten path and not a place where many North Americans or Europe, let's say Western Europeans, would have been to.
These places that I would elect to go to, they still kind of exist. You can still go to places in Siberia. There are places that are, you take the Trans-Siberian and the train doesn't stop. It just goes right by these villages, and all there is power going into them. There's no telephone. There's no, there's no cell towers. There's nothing around them. And these people, they still might get a newspaper dropped off, weekly or something. But the mentality is going to be stuck in an era that is so far behind them. And these are the places you still want to go and access because of their uniqueness. And so at the time, to go to Voronezh was it was just an astonishing way to let the country reveal itself in that time. And like
Right.
I said, you're talking about businesses, and I said that I wrote that this is the 21st century Russia, where you can buy Pepsi and a Coke machine. There were plywood sellers, guys selling CDs on the street corner, $2, and you could buy everything from Adobe. You could buy all of the windows. You could buy everything. They were all cracked. In fact,
Oh,
when a new
okay.
window came out or a new Adobe came out, there's an impetus in Russia. There's a challenge to try and just crack it as fast as you can. I
Oh, I
had
see.
private student who was a programmer, and he was just telling me that what they do, and it's just phenomenal. I mean, this entire culture that's rising beneath us is all done by programmers, and
Right.
it's all held by the anonymous people that are at the bottom of what we're doing, and they control all of our features, everything, all the apps that we use, everything that they design are
Hmm.
done by these geeks that have no names.
And in Russia, it's almost a national sport to crack the codes.
Yes.
I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this one
Bragging
private
rights.
student being hired or was being interviewed on the phone by a company in Denver that was going to potentially hire him. And so we had about, I don't know, 5 or 6 months to get his English up to a grade where he could, endure a telephone interview, and it was successful.
Oh, great.
So a
Good.
Russian programmer that I taught ended up in Denver.
Oh, great. Nice.
Yeah.
That's a success. Feather in your cap.
Yeah. Well, I had quite a few. I had successes and failures. One thing that was most interesting and pertinent at the time was that my students were between 19 and 25. And 25 is the age in Russia where you had to be married at 25. Otherwise, there was something kind of wrong with you. It was a societal thing, and the pressure was there. So the women that vastly outnumbered the men. At the most I ever had was one male in a class, and I
Right.
had to have 20 females. The rest of men go off to the army at 18 for two
Because
years.
they do have conscription there still, right?
They have conscription, and Chechnya was active. So the
Mm.
number of wounded men that were on sidewalks begging for change, they were 23, 24 years old. And
Wow.
these women are kind of left with this very impressive education. They know Shakespeare, far better than I do. Yeah, because they have an impetus to learn that. Whereas, if it's not, I could read Shakespeare right now. It's not what I choose to do with my
Yeah,
English.
I find it interesting that they would study Shakespeare because I don't know if in France, which is my background, if they study Shakespeare or if they focus on Molière, knowing the
Well,
French.
this wasn't part of the curriculum, but the 6th year, university, they've already done, high school
And
English. And this,
they've already studied the heck out of Pushkin and different authors.
They have. And the thing is that in Voronezh, if we use something like Prince George as some way to visualize Vancouver being the Moscow, that's where the money is. And so for them to get out of Voronezh is one thing. And then for them to use their English, the odds were against them, severely against them, to ever use their language skills in English in that city. And then to either get out, and I've got some amazing students who made it to New York City, and they're designers and stuff like that, and I'm very impressed with some of the lesser students who just did so much marvelous stuff with the power that they had in their English.
So your students, it was a real advantage for them to learn English at the time, especially. Was that their motivation a lot of times, was to leave Russia, or were they there to learn English so that they could broaden their opportunities within Russia? Or
if you understand that at the time, let's say, I've got the number in the book, but 75% of the internet was in English at the time. Having taught in other places, English is such a valuable asset to have. You don't need to have Shakespearean skills to work your tongue, but to be able to be an interpreter, which I guess is probably the most fundamental way that you would be able to use your language skills. They taunt their grades that they get on TOEFL and IELTS are the two major international tests that you take to qualify for an English score to get into a university in an English speaking country. So to have a high IELTS score or TOEFL score is something that is Facebook worthy. At the time, Facebook wasn't out, but it was something that people are proud of. There must be an equivalent for my talents in Russian. Somebody would say, "Oh, you're a 4.2 out of 10 or something, or a 3 point whatever." But looking back on it, the English is such a valuable score. It's the only thing you have to put on your CV, on your resume, is your IELTS score or your TOEFL. That just gives you the abilities. But then again, there was an Italian professor that it was her dream to work in Russia. She didn't speak a word of English. Even hello was a foreign thing to her. And we were the only two foreign teachers there. There was no real capacity to learn English. She wasn't able to learn it. And all the time that we were there, she developed her Russian skills. We both had French as a second language, which was our way to communicate. She knew the value of English. And coming from Italy, how could you not? Her love and mine as well was to go to Russia and to immerse ourselves in another culture. It wasn't to find it within ourselves, and her calling wasn't to learn English.
So Brent, the book is sectioned off into 4 chapters, if you will. Canadian summer, a Russian autumn, a Russian winter, a Russian spring, and a Canadian summer. So it's actually 5. Can you delve into each one of those a little bit and just maybe explain why you sectioned it off that way?
Well, I found the position in the summer. 2000 was not a great year for the internet as far as you could find anything out about foreign places, especially deep inside countries. I don't know what even existed at the time. America Online was out then. It was MySpace. Right. There was no communication with these places. I found that position, and of course it started in September. And I went there and said I was going to teach until the new year. But they were sectioned off that way because a Russian winter is something to behold. It's like a Winnipeg winter here, except it's in Russia, and it's Dr. Zhivago, it's Pasternak, it's a whole sort of revolution of thought that comes with a Russian winter. And I went through it in Estonia, which I hated. It was minus 20 every day, and everything's gray. The people are gray, the buses are gray, the buildings are gray, everything is, the snow's gray.
And the heating, I gather, is not like in Canada.
It is not. It is not. It's old radiators. They still, to this day, shut off the hot water for 6 months a year, depending on where you are in the country. But they shut off the hot water.
For 6 months a year, they shut off the hot water.
For 6 months a year. And so you're doing hot water on the stove to have a bath.
Huh. What's the reason for that? Is there a lack of water, or?
No, there was a Soviet era thing about not heating during the or wasting the fuel during the
I see. So it's fuel based.
At one time, the 90% of Russia's oil reserves were being wasted in their inability to refine it. It was very unresourceful. They were just losing it, just hand over fist, which was one of the reasons why the oligarchs got in there, and you just hire Shell or Chevron or somebody to come in and just, isolate the problems. And
Isn't Russia just a huge producer of petroleum and natural gas? I think most of Western Europe gets its natural gas from Russia.
23 countries down the line. In 2009,
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine did not pay its debt to Gazprom. And so Moscow shut off the gas going to Ukraine, and 23 countries down the line were fed through that. And so they all suffered. That's something that's almost inconceivable here. It's like the Houston problem that happened during our winter, where you're completely isolated and you're paralyzed because there's no way you paid your gas bill, and yet the country up the stream didn't do it. The prime minister at the time, crazy politics, the guy who had the acid, Yanukovych, I believe his name was, his face was burnt with acid.
Yes. Yeah.
And
well, actually, it wasn't acid. It was a poisoning. So it was more an interior poisoning than something that was applied locally.
Yeah, he was the president, and the prime minister at the time was
Yushchenko, right?
Timoshenko, the woman with the braided hair.
Yeah,
beautiful, and she went
right,
and she solved it on her own. Went to Moscow, and I was actually there. Her motorcade passed by me while I was outside of the Kremlin. Timoshenko, she got the gas flowing back to these countries, and then was imprisoned for 5 years for doing that, for violating or for one-upping her boss and going in and solving that problem on her own. But a very spectacular set of politics that was played out. Something that is inconceivable here. The wasting of the resources was, there was so much petroleum that they were just, there's no care in the work that you were, legislated to do. I mean, if you were producing oil, there was no motivation. Under the Soviet system, it was just your job, and everybody had a job. They were just depleting all of their resources unresourcefully. They were shutting off the heat and the hot water, and the same thing in Estonia. And it's just an unbearable, an unthinkable thing for cities that are in the northern climates to think that now's the time that the hot water goes off. And you can't believe that to have a bath, you've got to boil 4 pots of water on the stove.
Unreal, eh?
Yeah.
When you arrived in Russia, how was that experience? Like, how were you welcomed?
I would say it was a 5-star approach to 1-star ability. The city at the time was a very grimy. I remember seeing 5 kids, like 12 years old, drinking beer in a corner of a building, out back of a building. And it was just an astonishing, complex city. If you see a city in Russia, you normally just see all of these huge concrete blocks of apartment buildings. And they're usually 5 stories or 10 stories. And these were done by Khrushchev in the era when everybody had to have a home. So they just built these things everywhere. So I've lived in these 5 stories and never in a 10-story one, but the 10 stories have elevators, 1 elevator.
It's almost like a housing project in North America.
It's exactly like that, but done in such a massive scale that you have no say. They just demolish your home. It's just put things up.
They bulldoze and build.
And build, and which is the reason that Moscow has whatever 20 million people now. It's just a replication of further city stuff. I talk about the churches in Russia. These things were not demolished in the Stalin era. I mean, St. Basil's Church, it sits on Red Square. Stalin didn't demolish it. Atheism was, part and parcel of Soviet era, and yet these things still they weren't taken down. Did you ever see the movie with the Trans-Siberian one?
Oh, Woody Harrelson. And he and his wife are going, and she accidentally smuggles the Matryoshka dolls. It's phenomenal, and it's the Trans-Siberian Railway. And there's the church scene is it's epic because it's representative of all the churches in Russia. They weren't demolished in the Stalin era, where you would think that you would want to do if you had the motivation to keep everybody an atheist. You'd knock down the churches, but they were left standing. And so in Voronezh, they were refurbished with such a love, for rekindling of imagination and, religious wonder. They're beautiful. It's always amazed me how somehow art and architecture and beauty seems to survive through these regimes and invasions. Like even Apparently, like Hitler, he purposely told his generals to leave Paris basically untouched. He appreciated the architecture and he wanted it to still be a beautiful city.
His appreciation for art and the whole Nazi looting thing. My dad has written a book called Hitler's Present,
Really?
and he's been working on it for years, since the 90s. He's done a phenomenal amount of work. It has to do with Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev at the time,
Sure.
and finding this lost treasure that the Nazis had hid. And of course, these stories are coming out like crazy now about lost and found Nazi looting. But the appreciation for art and the collection, the amassing, they went to Tibet to go and well, rape and pillage, but to take all of these artifacts back and sort of keep them in some odd semblance of preserving the past that was.
And one of the places that first opened my eyes to the concept of looting in wars and especially Nazi looting was in Avignon. I don't know if you're familiar with Avignon, France. It was the Vatican for, I believe, 8 popes, because for some reason the Vatican left, I can't remember the reason, but it left Rome and was located in Avignon, France for 8 popes. And so
But
if you go to Avignon, you'll see this amazing Vatican, like a small Vatican, and you go in and you could still see areas where they chiseled out murals the Nazis did and took them home as memorabilia or as artifacts, I guess. Right.
and these were recovered.
To my knowledge, they aren't recovered anyway.
I know the song from French Immersion, Sur le Pont d'Avignon.
Yeah, I'm sure I still have pictures of them in my slideshow from when I traveled in '85.
Oh, you got to put those
Yeah.
digitize those.
But yeah, the Pont d'Avignon, the song, that bridge is there. I think the reason they danced on it is because it was never completed, so it's halfway across the river,
Oh,
and
wow.
so there was no traffic going through it. I have to verify that, but that's my recollection.
You've got Red Square and the Kremlin and stuff, and it's all
Mhm.
really neat to see as a tourist the first or second time. And the Bolshoi Theater is a block away, and the Arbat, the pedestrian street with dancing bears and the organ grinders with monkeys, is a couple of kilometers away. But
Hmm.
other than that, it's just a massive amount of city after city, and it just grows in these concentric rings. And so you
Hmm.
can say, I live on 30-kilometer road. These are just concentric rings that grow out from cities that are based around a center and that can grow concentrically.
So
Whereas in
most
Vancouver, we don't have that.
so most of the cities have those concentric rings.
Yes, same in China, same
Yeah.
in the Middle East. They just keep on expanding, and so
Yeah,
people
I
will.
think most cities are built on 2 principles, the grid system and that circular ring system. I believe it comes from Rome, that concept.
But
Yeah,
Rome itself, again, is not a tall city. It's not a skyscraper filled city.
right.
It grew in concentric rings, but it's also limited. It's got the ocean on
Mhm.
one side. But if you look at something like Winnipeg or Edmonton or Calgary, these places can just continually grow and eat up the outer expanses as more people moving into them. And so people, and outside Calgary will never ever go into downtown Calgary. There's no need. I mean, everything is out there in the suburbs.
Yeah,
Equally
Calgary's built on a very efficient grid system, and Winnipeg is more of a circular system like that.
My point is that
Yeah.
when you grow in these rings, you identify yourself by where you live, by the ring road that you find yourself on. You asked about how my entrance was. You're paraded around. I was interviewed on TV a lot of times because of the novelty of me being in their city. The institute where I was had satellite schools, so I would go out in these buses with other teachers, and we drop them off at places, and I'd go to another place and go out for a day. When you're first there being welcomed, you're absolute treated like royalty. You're meeting mayors. The fire department comes out to see you. They take you around in a limousine and show you things that nobody's ever seen. I was in a city called Stara Oskol, and I was taken around all of the quadrants of the city, and then the guys that through translator, that I will show you something that no foreigner has ever seen. We went way out. We saw the War Memorial, which is always something that you just passionately have to show an interest in, because these flames are always kept lit, despite the petroleum problems. These things are always get the gas first. And we drove out, and I was taken to the second largest strip mine in the world, and it's an inverted Everest. I mean, you were
Wow.
looking at like a kilometers down, at these things digging, and these trucks going up in these huge circles, all hours to get up to the top.
Wow.
Filled. These are the ones with the massive wheels that are 2 stories, 3 stories high. At the time, it was the second largest. But to view something like that is almost like being in an airplane looking.
Yeah, massive.
Massive, and a massive project, and just a phenomenal wonder of how things actually function in Russia. And one of the neat things is that Staroskol had this other city that was 20 kilometers away, and they figured that the city would keep growing and eventually eat this other city. And so people all moved out to where this other part. But at the time, and I don't know if it's still current, but Russia was the only country to have a negative birth rate.
Really?
And so, Staroskol didn't grow. I think that one of the relevant parts was there was a tram system that was set up, and they were taking these little trams up to like 160 kilometers an hour or something. So they took out gears to slow them down.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't recall exactly how it works out in the book, but the taking out of the gears was a hugely comical thing because they were just speeding back and forth between these two cities.
Wow.
Yeah, I was a Canadian, and I had to fight to not be seen as an American, which I had to do everywhere that I went, because and proudly get to do that. Essentially, you're seen as an American, you're seen as a Westerner, and as a North American person. Canadian doesn't hold anything. Paul Henderson's goal in Russia versus Canada in '72, I think it was.
Yeah, 72.
There's not a whole lot of accolades that reverberate around the world for Canada, at least at the time, in the early beginnings of the internet. To put that into better terms, I would take one class of students and bring them over to my place and get them email addresses. None of them had email addresses. And there'd be a huge thing. They'd all make dinner, and there'd be like 20 women milling around in my little apartment. And then when we do this, I'd write down their email addresses on pieces of paper. And I'm sure that some of them just chuckled and just threw it away and thought, this is never going to be, a relevant thing. Whereas I'm sure every single one of them is right now, horrified at that moment that they threw their first email away, thinking that would never, ever sort of.
And now they're totally immersed in social media and whatnot.
Absolutely. The city at that time was it almost looked war torn in places. That huge, blocks of concrete, which the apartment buildings are fashioned in, were laying, broken around. There's rebar just sticking out of the ground. Manhole covers are missing. But now money is poured in. And at the time, money was pouring in. People wanted to keep their money out of Moscow and put it somewhere. They would stick it into banks in Voronezh.
Why would they want to keep it out of Moscow?
More reasons. Why would you want to keep it into a city that was away from you? But their own reasons, and there's their own internal politics, which is bizarre. Like I was taken to a vodka factory to, as a guest to see everything, and for an hour walk around. But the president of the company has to show me, everything, and introduce me to all the employees, and I get to see the assembly line workers and all this stuff. But the vodka could not be sold or consumed in the city. It was all destined for Moscow. It was illegal to have it.
Right. I remember reading about that in the book. So what was the rationale for that? Was it because it was owned by Muscovites, or?
I'm guessing something like that.
Okay.
I'm not going to get into exactly how that it all plays out, because
it was just a law, and that was it.
It was a law. And so, even the consumption of that vodka, which I did consume in that city, these souvenir bottles that I was given, was illegal. So the money was going out of Moscow and going into Voronezh. And right across from my apartment was the Rossiya department store, the state department store, as it would have been in the Soviet era. It was 3 stories of ugliness. It was a sort of horrific mesh of food with clothing and, some fishing gear, and a guy who worked on jewelry. There was a huge board where you could buy, Levi's just to sew into fake jeans, and all of this money.
The counterfeit jeans.
You just buy all of these little labels and put them into your own, in the collar of a shirt or something. And
as I recall, in Soviet times, American jeans, they were a sought after commodity. So if you brought jeans, behind the Iron Curtain or into Soviet Russia, you could sell them for a pretty penny, right? People would do anything for them.
Legitimate ones. And you're a Westerner. But the other thing, when we were there in 1974, there's a story that I recollect because I've actually got these pouch of a ballpoint pen in 1974 in Russia was just like a phenomenal advancement of science when the Russians and Americans were in their space race, and the Americans were trying to design a pen that would work in space, that would push the ink, and you'd be able to write in space.
To deal with zero gravity.
To deal with zero gravity, whereas the Russians just use a pencil.
Right. And, simple solution.
So to have a ballpoint pen, or to have a clicky big pen, to give that to somebody was to give them the future. And in return, we got this pouch full of pins, of Soviet pins from that era. So,
and now they're buying the Fisher pen from the United States, which is the one that was developed for NASA. Yeah.
And funny how it flows back.
Pardon?
These stories will be lost if they're not told as they are in the book. These stories of snapshots of Russia, of these different countries prior to everything becoming a global social economy. We're all sitting here in a COVID era where I know that even my most cherished actors or rock stars are right now sitting at home, either, with a mask in their hand, and they're essentially just as Zoomable as you are. And they're probably bored for a lot of their day too. It's a strange phenomenon to find ourselves in. But prior to the internet taking over the world, these places didn't have access. Moscow was still that overnight train ride away. It was not, you could work from an outside city through the internet.
Right.
And pretend that you're in Moscow. Whereas I could pretend right now that I'm working in downtown Vancouver and I'm 30 kilometers from it.
One of the passages that I read recently in the book was about starting businesses, and how all the businesses at the time they couldn't take loans from banks. They had to take loans from the mafia to start their businesses if they needed financing, which probably most did.
There's basically one bank in Russia, Sberbank, Northern Bank. It means every 10, 20 meters in Moscow, there's a Sberbank bank machine or a bank. I mean, the money there is phenomenal. And so there was no ATM when I got there. And then there was an ATM, and it said outside, foreign accounts, and foreign was spelled wrong, which is, it's a word that everybody, tackles at some point in their life. But there it is, in big, huge letters, foreign spelled wrong, probably chiseled into stone.
That's perfect.
But they had a bank machine that worked once for me, and then it broke, and nobody ever got to use it again. There was the bank story where I went down and I was trying to exchange some American cash I had. And the guy at the border with a machine gun, Vladimir, blind in one eye. And he's just, I would give you a better exchange than the bank. And he's guarding the bank. So he's sitting in his little ladder. He's sitting there with his machine guns clanking as we're getting into his car. And, it's comical.
So he's working for the bank, and he's wanting to do a side deal to do the exchange with you, circumventing the bank, because he's going to give you a better rate, and he wants the American dollars.
And he wants the American dollars.
That's something, eh?
Oh, it's phenomenal.
Well, the quote in the passage that I read too in the book is, if you have money, you have big problems. And it's easier just to be poor than have to deal with the mafia on the money.
There's a prestige. One woman that I knew, we went to this, I didn't even know that it existed on the main street. And we go into this underground restaurant and a club, and she paid $300 US or something for our meal. And it wasn't that great. It was just that you were there and you were amongst these, these elite people, most of them from Moscow, most of them, all mafia money, all money that was just flowing. To have money was to be able to show it. To have that Levi's tag on the back of your thing was to show that you were in some way connected with something that was beyond other people, beyond the ordinary.
You're showing your status.
The poverty and depression shines through in Russia. You just, once you're there, you just sort of adapt to this disassociation of people and how they attack life.
It's one thing to have people with money, but if they're flaunting it in an environment where people are struggling, that makes for quite a contrast.
It makes for a horrific contrast, because these people were at one time, just as impoverished and 10 years earlier, they were maybe 10 years or 15 years old. And when the Soviet Union fell, and now they're, however they came on their wealth, you've got to have a Mercedes, you've got to have an Audi, you've got to, in some way, you've got to have a foreign connection. You know, we were sitting there and they're all singing happy birthday, completely wrong in this restaurant. But to say that is like for us to say, you know, encore at the end of a rock concert, you know, encore, yelling something that's French. Encore, yeah, to have a connection with something that makes you feel like you're outside of the situation that you're in, I guess is probably the best way to put it.
The ironic thing about flaunting the wealth in that society is that just a few years earlier, they were an egalitarian society, or supposed to be an egalitarian society, where everybody was treated equally, and any kind of wealth was frowned upon and looked at with distrust and suspicion.
Yeah, that's why being able to speak English for my students is to be able to watch movies in English, to be able to. Now still got a private student now who learned his English through watching, you know, American movies and TV. The phenomenal amount of understanding and time invested in that to get back what he's capable of. And I've had a few astonishing students in the past that have been able to watch movies and pick up on all of these, you know, all of the cues that we would maybe miss, that we would look at, you know, James Dean is holding, or Al Pacino, and that you're more affluent, the more that you're able to show some side of maybe the American dream as it was, to be able to parse that out to people. And obviously, you know, these men are coming back from Chechnya, all, you know, half of them, you know, half of their bodies are wrecked, and they haven't got the education. They don't understand English, don't speak English. And now they're being flooded with this. And the more the students were able to grapple with English then was just a show of force, a show of will and courage and affluence. And especially in a small town, it's
intelligence, I guess.
An intelligence.
How far away is that city, Voronezh, from Chechnya?
From Chechnya.
Yeah, because that's where the war was, and these young men you're talking about are coming back injured, or coming back from the war in Chechnya.
Well, it's basically due south. Yeah, it's funny how you measure things by train times and how long it takes to get somewhere. It's a 12-hour trip, a 24-hour trip. I mean, the train system there is basically like the interstate system in America. I mean, you can get anywhere by train. It's more important than the roads. The research that it took to even do that book, and the one that I'm currently writing or finishing, the Trans-Siberian, was unthinkable. I mean, you're going through marshland, you're going across, you know, lakes that freeze. And so everything was measured by how long it takes to get somewhere by train.
Just to frame the train side a little bit, you do write about some train trips in this book, but you are also writing, and you've been writing for a number of years, a book that is solely about train travel, which we'll talk about a little later. But some of your adventures in this book on the trains, you describe it very well, and it's quite interesting to see the culture unfold inside the train, with people speaking with each other and having a shot of vodka or two or several, etc.
My favorite place in the world, if I had one place to pick, a moment that I could pull from my memory where I've had probably some of the neatest experiences, it would be in the vestibule at the end of a carriage, you know, smoking, and you're there at whatever hour of the day it is, and with whomever you're sharing that little tiny space, and it's cold. It's it's the temperature it is outside. Often it's like minus 20, and you're there, you're smoking, you're doing vodka shots or something, and there's an immediate friendship. The barriers are taken down between, you know, the train carriages.
Yeah, it kind of equalizes things, doesn't it? Because I've had similar experiences in other countries. I've spent about 9 months traveling around Western Europe, mostly some of Eastern Europe, on the train system. And there were all kinds of people I met. It was amazing. I have so many stories from the train experiences.
Well, the Trans-Siberian was, you know, pre-internet days, 1997. You had 9 days on, you know, you can lock yourself in your room and try and read and pass the time watching Birch and Tiger go by, or you can go to the restaurant car, and the contrast is just phenomenal. You just meet people you never ever meet. These are from the other side of the train, because if you're a Westerner, you're stuck on the front part of the train, which is Western wagons. It even says West Germany on the train. On the other side of the restaurant car, which is halfway, you get the Russian trains, and these things don't have there's no noise protection. You're listening, the wheels are like right underneath you. You get into some, they're actually like shelving, and people are just sleeping on shelves. It's just a warehouse of people on a carriage. And so these people, this is how they travel. And so to say that something is so far by train is, it's the categorically the way that you would express how
Mm.
the distance to someone. They wouldn't think in kilometers. They think of how far it was in hours by train,
Right.
because that
So
was
you
what
would
you had
say
when you
here,
were.
you would say, oh, it's a 3 hour drive or 4 hour
Yeah,
drive to somewhere. But in
yeah,
Russia, you would say it's a 4 hour train ride.
4 hour train ride. I mean, they're just as timely and time sensitive. In Russia, the trains are far more trustworthy than the roads are.
Do they run on Swiss time, as we say?
On Swiss time, on Zulu time, on.
No, are they precise with their timing?
Oh, very, very precise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, is that
very.
right?
And there, you'll take an express train to Voronezh. You could take
Mm-hmm.
the milk run if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted, but like the Trans-Siberian, it doesn't stop at these little tiny places that have 100 little huts or town with dirt roads.
Mm-hmm.
You just sail past these places, but you could go and take the train that would manifest itself in terms of weeks if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to.
I
I
gotta
don't
tell
think
you
a
a little.
Westerner would have been allowed in at the time, would have been allowed to do that at the time, because it would have given you the permission. Still wasn't there. Well, I learned, the wrong way about taking pictures. You don't take pictures of, things you're not allowed to.
So what
Um,
happened? What happened with that?
I'd gotten back from going to St. Petersburg with my boss, and I had a phenomenal time. And I got back and I had a free Sunday. And so I was cleaning my apartment and I found these 6 rolls of film. And so I just thought, why not just go take these over to the Konica place up the street and develop them. And so Russians would they just develop the negatives. In fact, the first time when I was there and I developed my pictures, I just got back the negatives. And I thought, this woman's crazy. Like, what's going on here? I haven't got any pictures. But the Russians will take these strips of negatives and put them on light boards, and they'll decide, because of the cost, which ones they'll develop. And
Mm.
so my quote in there is that the best of Russia is sitting in drawers somewhere, undeveloped.
Ah, okay.
Um, and so, this conic woman, I just tell her, develop everything, even the black ones, right? Because, just I had the money, and you want to see what you took a picture of. Well, I was showing these pictures to the old babushkas that were sitting out back of my little apartment complex, knowing that they'd never get to Moscow. If they'd ever been, they'd never get there again, and they'd never get to St. Petersburg. Just the cost is too huge. And so I was showing them these pictures, but I didn't even know it was in these pictures. And to militia, the police walked around the corner and arrested me and took me over and held me. And then later that night, I was transported to a precinct, and I was ripped out of a van. It was dark. I was ripped out of my trench coat and thrown down there's 12 steps, 12 concrete steps. And I woke up, I don't even know how much longer later. I was covered in my own blood, and I was paralyzed from the waist down, and I was being just beaten, savagely beaten by these guys in a cell. And then I was
By
dragged
other
up.
by other people that were taken prisoner, I guess.
Well, yeah, people who were in jail
People that
for
were in
whatever.
jail. Yeah.
Um, and then I was dragged out by the militia at some point, and I was interrogated about what each picture was. And through my meager Russian, I was trying to explain why I had taken these pictures. Well, I mean, all the evidence is there. I had taken these liberties because I'd been there for so long. I thought that I was maybe exempt from these old Soviet rigid rules about taking pictures, especially from the train taking pictures, the airport taking pictures of everything I could.
Oh, okay.
And you don't do that because I took pictures of beggars. There was a woman who minus 30, and she's out there all day long with an icon, Jesus and Mary, and she's got this little bowl, and she's just there for kopecks, let alone rubles, hoping for something in minus 30. And it was something phenomenal to catch some of these beggars that were like our own grandparents, surviving on a Russian pension, which at the time was just a horrific low amount. So they were collecting bottles or begging on the streets, and these are our own grandparents, as I would shadow it today. And so I took pictures. You're not allowed to take pictures in the market. You can't take pictures showing what is, almost extreme poverty, but something that I had adapted well to. And so I took pictures of these things. So these 124 whatever exposures were, some evidence that I was spying, and so I was thrown into the next cell, and then the guard just yelled, he's a spy, spion. And so
Okay.
just savagely beaten.
So were they worried about you doing some kind of espionage, like a spy work, or about you telling the world about the underbelly of Russia?
Oh, I think it was both of those things. First of all, I had been told that the KGB, that the FSB as it was then, was routinely going through my flat, and
Oh,
I was teaching, and I would have noticed something, if these guys were pulling some of the stuff that I've seen in movies where they're going through and just I would have noticed something would have been amiss. And so I'd take a hair and I just put it in the door and make sure that it was secure. And I would look, half the time that hair was gone, when I got back. Whatever they had on me at the time, whatever I was, charismatic person who was always out there, always going to the market, always, going to the Philharmonic, or absurdly taking the liberty of exposing what is probably the cruelest turning point in the post-Soviet era, was the sort of raising up of the extreme poverty into some semblance of a lower middle class, and here I am just taking pictures in churches, taking pictures of wherever you would not have been able to take it in the Soviet era.
yeah. One of my experiences with that kind of concept is coming across from Sweden to Eastern Germany by ferry, and I was traveling with a Polish fellow who had escaped from Poland during the Russian invasion in 1982, and he was concerned about how he would be met in East Germany. And he was very nervous when I pulled out my telephoto lens and I started taking pictures of the shoreline. And he said, you can't take pictures of the shoreline. You put that camera away. So yeah, there was a lot of scrutiny and a lot of caution in taking pictures of anything that might have been perceived as outside information that could be used against them. I had the same experience when I was taking pictures of Checkpoint Charlie and the guards started running at me. And I took pictures of it. I took pictures of them running at me, actually. Luckily, they didn't rip out the film out of my camera. They just told me just to stop.
I've
So,
got a phenomenal picture of two Russian policemen coming at and running at me. It's a phenomenal picture, and I couldn't believe that I actually had it.
and that was in
But
Russia?
Moscow, it was, what are you doing? Why do you think that you would even be able to do this? Why do you even think that you have the right to do that? I guess it's an Islamic thing as well as a Russian thing. You're capturing somebody's soul.
Right.
When you do this right now, you can see, bad pictures with the headlines. You can capture a picture with whomever they want to make fun of, caught in mid sentence with their eyes closed or with, in some goofy thing because of the video. But in the days of photography, your shots were limited. You were limited to the number of exposures you had. But so what you were taking pictures of was likely far more sensitive than you would do today with a camera, where you just take video, or you just take. I was in North Korea for a week, so now I had learned my lesson 5 years prior, that when they say don't take pictures, you don't freaking take pictures.
Yeah,
there are
they're serious about it. Absolutely.
So serious about it, because
absolutely
you just have the power, the authority that they have, and for you to just think that you can just walk in. It's just like walking in and just saying, well, no, I can do heroin here. It's just a complete violation of the sanity.
Or it's like drinking in a Muslim country, or it's like doing, smoking marijuana in certain countries as well. It's, just something that's going to land you in jail pretty quickly.
Not so much that it's against the law. It's that it's a treasonous act against authority. You're willing to just sit there and smoke a joint and take pictures of stuff in some external city in Russia. That levels you across the board with on par with what you're capable of doing. And what is this guy already doing? Well, what did they already have on me? If the FSB was routinely going through my flat, what did they already think that they had on me that I only verified by developing my rolls of film? That was the experience that ended everything. I couldn't walk. I was locking my knees. There was no sensation. My feet didn't work. It took a year for this to heal itself. I'm to this day, I've got massive arthritis in my wrist, because they were lifting me up from underneath my rib cage, their hands up, and lifting me up against the wall, and then just dropping me like 6-8 feet in the air and just dropping me, which for some reason was, I guess, the way that they just enjoyed, hurting people. It was attempted murder. It was absolutely, this was just a long, torturous route to a certain death. and the consequences of which I'm still staggering with today. This is 19 years on.
And how did that come to an end?
Well, I had to get an exit visa. My brother and his girlfriend.
How did you manage to leave their confinement?
Oh, the next morning, I mean, my money was gone, but I was everybody else was taken on one side of the wall, and I was taken on the other. I guess because I was a Westerner. But then, just given my stuff was just sitting there in this other room, my clothes, because I was just left in my underwear in these cells, and then just had to pull myself up these frickin' 12 stairs I'd been throwing down, and then pulled myself across this dusty precinct lot trying to flag down cars. Didn't even know where I was in the city, and I just knew where Garcia department store. And then everything quickly unraveled. I mean, all of my little secrets, living with a student, and then the whole school, just what the hell is going on? I mean, the head of security there, I mean, these are all ex-military guys, right? These are hardcore. There's no goofing around. These guys, just Kalashnikov is like, a pen to them. These are tools that they use. So they went down and asked, what had happened, why I was there, and there was no record of me being there.
Oh, I see. So the school went to the precinct in your defense to find out why they treated you that way. And there was no record. Everything had vanished.
Everything had vanished. I'd never been there.
Interesting.
Phenomenally interesting, because now there'd be digital footprints everywhere. But
I gather your photography did not leave the building with you.
No, I did. I even had my some of my negatives. I didn't.
Really?
But yeah.
How did you manage? Why would they leave that with you?
Because I developed them, and my story would only lead me back to my own apartment as I can figure it. Where were my pictures if I didn't develop them, and there was no reason for me ever being been there? Then what happened?
So do you still have the photos today?
Yeah,
you do. I got to see those.
But yeah, I've got most of them, but some of them are missing. There are obvious ones, because I was sitting there holding on to the counter. I'm being asked about every single question. Who is this? What is this? Where was this? Because how many people from Vancouver get to, say, West Edmonton Mall? And then there I am. I'm at the Aurora ship in St. Petersburg. I'm in, St. Peter's Square. I'm in the Hermitage. I walked the Hermitage alone, almost by accident, just because the people I knew the security, and they said it's closed. They said, hey, let this Canadian in. And it's like I walked the entire Hermitage alone, taking pictures. Those pictures were in there, and then I've got those pictures.
I see.
So
we have to do someday.
Who gets to walk the Hermitage alone? And, who's at the P&E, all to himself.
Plus, you went to the Duma too, right?
Went to the Duma, yeah. And
were there photos of that there too?
Yes.
Wow.
Zhirinovsky, who is ultra right, just a fanatic, sort of maniacal, diabolical, third in line after Putin for presidency. But he's held on since I was in Estonia, and he's just a crazy guy. And yeah, he was my connection. And I was in the Duma.
And you had a picture with him?
I know, not with him, but I got pictures of him. Like, do
you want to tell us about that experience as well?
Just connections through students, and one student's husband worked in Moscow for Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who's the LDPR, the Liberal Democratic Party, I guess. Not that it really matters, not that it would be democratic. So when I was in Moscow, you get wanded, you get taken down, right down almost to your underwear. Everything's taken off, all your jewelry's taken off, and you're just like, absolutely not allowed within this building for security check. And so then up to whatever floor it was, and into this incredible, the party of the LDPR and Zhirinovsky's. There's 1,000 pictures of him, kissing babies and hugging people and smiling, with all these insane thoughts about taking back the Soviet Union and taking back the Baltics, and the Russia needs these resources, and we invested so much money in these countries, and our fleets were there, and we put in ports and all his infrastructure, and then all of a sudden the Soviet Union collapses, and he was probably one of the least happy people about it, and so he's been trying to get into power to reestablish whatever he could rebuild from the Soviet Union, which is why the NATO expansion to the Baltics was such a powerful thing, and why Belarus, which is the country that is at the bottom, the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are each independently and in their own sense, un-Russian. They have their own histories. They've only been colonized by other people. Poor Estonia is there, and then the Swedes come, and then they free themselves. Then the Danes come, and then they free themselves. Then the Germans come, and then they free themselves. And then Russians come, and so Hitler had taken over the Baltics and gave them to Russia. That's how they ended up in that sad state. But Belarus is still to this day as Soviet as it can be. It is the last bastion of the Soviet Empire. Lukashenko, the president, has been in power since 1994. And so he's maintained this power. He tore up the constitution. It is the only dictatorship in the West. It's the North Korea of Europe. His ministers and him can't fly into Europe. I mean, they can be forbidden to attend, whatever. It was the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia that decided amongst themselves, Yeltsin and them, to end the Soviet Union and to lock Gorbachev in his dacha, back in the day, and what unfolded in those tragic days in the 90s, 91.
Why were you meeting with this government official at the Duma?
The student's husband, he was in my flat for New Year's Eve, and it was just a really, neat guy. And so, if you're ever in Moscow, look me up. Well, you look him up. And so when my dad flew into Moscow because he was in Europe, I had a presidential limousine to the airport, to Sheremetyevo Airport, and to pick up my dad. And so my dad came back.
Your dad being at the time an official in the tourism industry.
Yeah,
for Canada.
Tourism Vancouver.
Yeah, Tourism Vancouver, yeah.
And having a very wide scope of understanding of the world and tourism, and generating revenue for this and that for the what would essentially become the Olympic Games in Vancouver.
Right.
And he had this impromptu meeting with these officials in Zhirinovsky's office. We're sitting there, and there's a picture of Saddam Hussein right in the corner. And it's just in a presidential limousine. I mean, it's just so. I was setting up my own warning flares. If there's anybody who was curious, just one person following my activities for the government's sake, then I was leaving breadcrumbs left and right. And,
I see. If somebody's looking at all the pieces and not connecting the dots, they could be led to be suspicious.
Absolutely.
Or that could be led to be.
And whatever they generated from going through my apartment, were they, if that was actually, there was 5 guys, going through everything that I owned all the time, as I was told it was happening. It was the day when you would leave your laptop on. And my laptop was in my apartment the whole time. I didn't take it to school. You couldn't leave the camera on. That wasn't an option in those days to record your entire day. But if there was, 5 or 6 guys who were doing some of the movies of East Germany, where they just go in and just, the guy's gone, and the entire thing's filled with microphones and little cameras and stuff. And I had no idea, what I was doing that was suspicious or what wasn't. I've just kind of always had an open door policy because I just assumed that I was always under some observation.
Well, and there's no shortage of suspicion in those times in Russia and Soviet times.
It's curious why somebody would want to leave Moscow. It's curious why you wouldn't want to be in a lucrative. I mean, if you're a teacher and you wanted to, whatever your game was, it was in Moscow. It was you would not come to some place and for a meager salary to teach at these places for your own purposes. Which was exactly what I was there to do. It was not to experience Moscow. I didn't want that. I wanted the Prince George experience. I wanted the Winnipeg experience, and not the Vancouver, not the Montreal or Toronto experience. I wanted the smaller, the real, the down to earth, the real Russia.
The less gentrified, less foreign influenced version of Russia.
And that's exactly what I got, and exactly what I tried to put into the book. Was a snapshot of what Russia was actually like at that sort of fulcrum of turning it around.
The USSR was a huge place, so capturing that moment in time, less than a decade after its dissolution.
And then the experience in Estonia only helped me feel more confident in myself with being able to go, anywhere in Russia. And I could have been anywhere. I could have been, 3 days by train from Moscow, and it wouldn't have mattered. I would have been just as happy, with any place that I had found. And it just happened to be that city and at that time. And so that snapshot is it's not the same city I saw in 2009, not the same city I saw in 2013 or 14. So it's a vastly different world, and the people are vastly different. The poor people are vastly different. The rich people are the city's vastly different. It's almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, I could see that. Is there anything that you wish you would have included in the book, but you didn't? Any people or any places or any adventures?
I will spill this now that it's 19 years on, but there's one woman in that book has numerous women that come in out of my life.
Young man in a foreign country?
Yeah. And this sort of, unicorn in the mist. Yeah. There's one woman in there that I'm still in contact with who didn't make that book. And it was the only woman that I would have gone back there to stay with forever. So she's not mentioned in the book. It was the heart tugging actual, those pangs of love that would have left me there. And had this jail incident and arrest not occurred, then maybe, things would have worked out differently. But there was like a 1 week turnaround. It was get this guy the hell out of the country. Like, just get him out of here. This is bad on all fronts. All of my charades fell apart. All of these women started coming out of the woodwork and meeting each other. What the hell's going on here? Who are you? And then, well, I'm this to him, and I'm this. You're the student, you're the teacher. Just all these relationships. I was in no shape to even defend myself. It was just like,
yeah. You had dug yourself a bit of a hole in that one, didn't you?
Yeah, this guy's in my flat with machine guns. Just what the? Who are we? We don't even know who the bad guy is here. But get this guy out of here. So yeah, I had to get an exit visa and get extricated from the country, emergency flight home. The whole thing that you hope would never happen. And it was one of the worst experiences I've ever gone through.
I'm sure. So the experience of being in Russia was a great experience, but it didn't end in a positive way.
Ended in the worst possible way it could have. But what came out of that was a book that deserved to be written. And where every word is weighed and you're judged by your own peers, which are fortified in your head with your own family and of writers, and you just want to create something that actually is a display of is a work. And I didn't think that I would extend beyond that book. It had to be put down in the words. And I realize now that capturing that city and that state was just an amazing time.
Awesome. Well, it's a great read. It's Of Russia, A Year Inside.
The book is really kind of neat because it was just a series of vignettes. You can almost open the book and just find like half a page or a full page. It's just sort of an encapsulation of what's going on at the time.
That's true. I noticed that when I was coming back to it after having read it more attentively before, that you could jump in and just pick up a different section if you open a page.
Yeah, I would love to read a book in this format. It's still enjoyable for me to just pick up and go, wow, right there is just a snapshot of just what Russia was like then.
It's available on Amazon, and it's a great read. I encourage everybody to read it, especially if you have an interest or a curiosity about Russia at that time, or the Soviet Union, or even if you want some perspective on things that are happening now. There's some interesting insights, and it's a pleasure to read. So do you want to shift gears a little bit now and tell us about the project you're working on now and the conclusion of the writing of your book about trains? Because I understand that's coming to a point where it's going to be published soon.
Yeah, the working title has been The Ties That Bind, and it's a circumnavigation of the world by rail. So we took the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1997. I'd written about that, and we thought that would be the only train trip that we were going to do, my father and brother and I. And we weren't sure that we could stand, 9 days on a train with each other. And then we did Canada, east to west. And then we did America from New York to San Francisco. And then we did Hong Kong up through Beijing and into North Korea for a week. And each of these were 3 years apart. And then my brother realized that if we went from Moscow to London, we would have gone around the world by rail, having done Moscow to China earlier. So we went about doing that. And in 2009, did this kind of blocky step back from Moscow through Belarus, Minsk, and through Ukraine and Poland and Germany, France, back to England. And a phenomenal amount of stories that come just from that, from smugglers and counterfeiters and insane things that, if you stick your nose into other people's lives and inject yourself into craziness like North Korea, you just end up finding a wealth of information that lies behind sort of these facades of people that you would never know if you just stuck in your own carriage. So, on the train and some guy's slipping you his 357 underneath the table, and you're like, what the,
He was handing you a gun?
Handing me his gun, the mafia guy, yeah.
Wow.
Proof that he was who he said he was. Like, what? Okay, yeah, that's a loaded gun. Yeah, you're who you say you are, and probably capable of the stuff that you.
Well, I would say from my experiences traveling that when you go to a country, you have a preconceived idea of it. And every time I've gone to a different country, those preconceived ideas have been totally shattered, and I've ended up with a whole different perception.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the deeper that I throw myself into these countries, the more, having motorbikes in Iraq or something, these are sort of the tools of how you end up meeting people that help you with whatever your problems are, with whatever you're doing. You end up having students who can help you. You end up with shop owners who will, trust you with their shop when they leave for a half an hour and you're just sitting there in their store. I mean, for some reason, you're just an iconic sort of figure because you're otherworldly to them, and there's no way they're ever escaping the gravity of their own situations. They're never getting out. There are people who will never, my students in China that I know will never ever get out of that country, let alone that city, never get to Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong, just never getting there, and no real impetus, no trajectory to actually send them on that way, even though they're studying English hard.
So on your train travels and in The Ties That Bind, your new book, are you talking about the times off the train as well?
Oh yeah.
Or were there many times off the train?
The train travel, but I'm still amazed that Minsk, Belarus, was probably after Vancouver and maybe Venice, Italy, one of the most incredible cities I've ever seen. Just amazingly beautiful, and no advertising. The buildings are just buildings. The thing in Moscow is to put 2-story letters up top for saying Sanyo or Sony or whatever, Honda, and just illuminating them.
Massive billboards.
And so Moscow is just a whole halo of light. It's just an ugliness that and you go to Minsk and you're just night and day. Ironic thing is there's no border. Like I was sitting up at 3:00 in the morning waiting for the border to come as we left Moscow, and you're going overnight train to Minsk, Belarus, and I'm sitting there waiting for it to happen. You pull into Minsk at 6:00 in the morning, and you're no border. And
now, why would that be? Because it's not part of the Soviet Union anymore, and
it is the country that has the largest handshake with the Russian past,
but not the present.
It's like North Korea relies on China. It has that handshake. It's insalvageable beyond its own means. I mean, in the Soviet Union, Belarus was known for its tractors. Along comes John Deere and Caterpillar and just, crushes their technology,
Understandably.
So a phenomenal amount of train travel, again, caught up in snapshots that are sort of mapped out around the world, places that are right now inaccessible to anyone because of the pandemic. But, in the future, how many people are going to decide to go to North Korea, and what's it going to be like? The fear can be perpetuated forever and wherever they want. So, some of these countries are encapsulated at a time that will never exist in the future.
True. And you capture that in the book, The Ties That Bind.
Yeah. And it's been a project to manifest itself into an editable document and chip it down. And 3 professional editors have hacked away at it so that I could get it down to a palatable size.
And when do you anticipate that's going to be released?
In publishing terms, it would be the next fall. You would say a year and a half, but with an acceptable ability to just Kindle it when submitted. If accepted, then it could be within 6 months.
Great. I'm looking forward to that read too, Brent. Great. Well, thanks for joining me today. It's been a great chat, and I hope a lot of people pick up the book of Russia, and looking forward to The Ties That Bind as well. Why don't we sign off with that?
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Over and out. And that concludes this Bernie Chats. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, like, share, and feel free to comment. Thank you for supporting the channel. I look forward to seeing you on the next Bernie Chats.